So another central tenet of Ayurvedic medicine is going to be all near and dear to your heart, and I think that probably we're preaching largely to the choir here, but just maybe sort of give you maybe one or two new nuggets that you don't already know. So as you can see, the old Hippocrates quote, all disease begins in the gut, and Ayurveda very much believes that as well. And in fact, you mentioned functional medicine, and a lot of people say that functional medicine is now just putting the science behind Ayurveda, essentially. But it's really, for the most part, it's just now giving us, Ayurveda says take turmeric, and now you go to a functional medicine thing and they're talking about curcuminoids and blah, blah, blah. And it's, well, Ayurvedics have known that for thousands of years. So it all goes together. It's really nice. Next slide. So one thing, it's obviously impossible to sort of do the entirety of Ayurveda or functional medicine or anything in one small talk. So we wanted to focus on the gut, and not just the gut, but just our microbiome, just sort of the sort of the life that lives in and on our body, which is kind of a gross idea, but it's really important and crucial to what keeps us healthy. So, a lot of this isn't my own sort of creation, but I liked it, so I thought it was worth mentioning, and a nice way to think about it is that our body really is like a coral reef, and it has ecosystems and sub-ecosystems, and if you are at one part of a coral reef, it's going to have certain kinds of fish and plants. You go deeper into that same coral reef, and it's going to be different plants, different fish. And so we got to start thinking about our body in that way, because it really helps a lot. Because if you look at it, our body in the mouth, next. I'm telling her and then I forget myself. So our mouth, just in our mouth alone, we have about 1 billion bacteria. And we obviously have viruses and parasites and funguses and all kinds of other creepy crawlies that live on us. I'm going to focus mostly just on the bacteria, because that's really, I think, in many ways the most central piece of it. So like I said, the mouth has about 1 billion bacteria that live in it. Our skin's got about 1 trillion. And then by comparison, our gut has about 100 trillion bacteria that live in it, which amounts to about 2.5 pounds. So if you want to go on a nice weight loss plan, just take some antibiotics and you lose a couple pounds in diarrhea, more or less, because you're killing off all your guts, the gut flora. But it's interesting, because one of the things that a lot of people really like to point out is there's actually more bacterial cells in our body than there are human cells, by about 10 to 1. And so it's kind of an interesting sort of question, is if there's 100 trillion bacterial sort of cells and there's only about 10 trillion of us, who's who? Are we the humans having a bacterial experience, or the bacteria's having a human experience? And who, it's when you start thinking about it that way, it's a little bit strange. And so more and more, I think we're recognizing that the microbiome is almost sort of this unrecognized organ, in a sense, that's in our gut. Next slide. So let's see, I'll just make sure. Yeah, so what influences that balance? So obviously our genetics, and there's a lot of research going on with our genes. A lot of us feel like it's sort of the will of God. I've got the gene to have breast cancer like Angelina Jolie, so I'm going to go and just get a double mastectomy, rather than thinking about all the other stuff that happens in between there. Lifestyle, obviously, is what we're all talking about here: diet, stress, early colonization. So again, largely preaching to the choir here. Being born in hospitals, C-sections, things like that are obviously not ideal, and we're going to talk about that a little bit. And then medical practices: antibiotics for every little runny nose, and vaccines, excessive hygiene, things like that. All that comes together to create this sort of balance. Next slide. So where do we get the bacteria? Like I said, it starts really in the womb. It's not as sterile. There's more and more research coming out that the amniotic fluid isn't as sterile as we once thought it was. Obviously, it's not heavily contaminated, but it's not completely sterile like they used to think. Next slide. Obviously, we would always want to aim for a vaginal birth as the baby comes down the birth canal. The vagina has it's a unique little ecosystem in itself in terms of the bacterial balance that's in there. And as the baby's skin goes through the vagina, as their mouth goes, as they're getting pushed out, and they're taking all of those colonies into their gut, and it starts to populate their intestinal tract. And so it's really, that's their first probiotic, basically, that they're getting. And it's pretty well documented now that if you have a C-section, that your baby, or your child rather, is going to have a much higher chance of having a lot of the different diseases, whether it's asthma, autoimmune, all of those things. Next slide. So I didn't even know you were all into the We Can Do It thing. I didn't. I'm just like Rosie the Riveter too, I guess. So what are the kinds of things that you can do? I mean, obviously, all of us are pretty much parents already here, so there's a little bit sort of you can't change the past. If you are planning on having more kids, though, you want to make sure you do a detox before you're pregnant. If you have amalgams, get them out. If you want to do, some gentle detoxing or chelations or any of that kind of stuff, you really want to do that before you conceive. Yesterday, I saw a young mom, first-time mom, and she's breastfeeding, and she decided to do a detox cleanse, a juice fast detox cleanse while she's breastfeeding her baby. And, and then shockingly, the baby was a little bit grouchy when she was doing this. And he's like, you think that I might have mobilized some toxins? I'm like, yeah, maybe. So I'm like, let's not do that until the breastfeeding's all finished. Drink a little green smoothie now and again, it's fine, or do chlorella or whatever you want, but not like that, And then also don't let the OBs pressure you into C-sections if, just because they need to go home or, it's the weekend and I'm just going to schedule it or whatever. I mean, obviously there's a time and a place where, you need it because of an emergency, but don't let them pressure you. It's just not appropriate because it causes lifelong issues or potentially for the child. And then obviously breastfeed as long as you're comfortable doing it, or they're leaving to college, whichever comes first. I appreciate the laugh because sometimes it seems like, yeah, good. Next slide, please. So one of the things that it's like my little call to action is like letting kids be dirty, because she was before we knew better, was a huge germaphobe. She was wiping the entire supermarket down and all that other stuff, and dogs and germs, and dogs lick their butt and then they're licking your kid and this and that and all these different things. And they've actually really found that a lot of these things are not good. It's that hygiene hypothesis. It's good to let the kids, no one wants their kids sick, of course. But if we can boost their immunity and then let them have the exposure to all these things, all these little small infections that they get as children help stimulate and balance their immune system, which then enables them to fight off the bigger, badder nasties out there, whether it's measles, whether it's, something else. It's really, really crucial to do that. So let them get dirty. It's okay, And I think, they've studied it. People that have dogs, people that live on farms, all these things, they don't have the asthma and the allergies and all of these things that like all of us do that, live in the sterile sort of suburbs. Next slide. The other thing, obviously, is, excessive antibiotics are going to be hugely problematic. These are just a couple of things. The left graph shows the more number of antibiotic courses in the first few years of life increases their risk of having inflammatory bowel disease like Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. The one on the right is showing increased childhood asthma with more antibiotic use. I used to work in ER urgent care for many, many years, and it was sort of the bane of our existence because although you guys may not want the antibiotic, a lot of pediatricians are used to being pressured into an antibiotic from an inpatient family. It's like the kid's dying of strep throat, and the first question they ask is, well, can you go to school tomorrow? It's like, no, he's got strep throat, I mean, in that case, maybe it's one thing, but, they've got green boogers for 3 days, and so therefore they need amoxicillin or whatever. So, if the doctor tells you, if you go to your pediatrician and they tell you they don't need antibiotics, believe me, they don't. Because honestly, it's in their best interest just to write you a script, shut you up, make you happy, they're out the door and on to the next patient. So if they're discouraging it, again, you guys are probably not the ones pressuring them, but they're used to moms pressuring them. And so sometimes if you perceive that they're just throwing an antibiotic at you, it's learned behavior on their part because they feel like that's what the mom wants and it'll keep her happy and she's off my back. But try to avoid it if necessary, or unless absolutely necessary. Next slide, please. Another thing, again, we're going to get a little bit more into the gut, segue into this. What we eat rapidly changes the bacterial balance in our intestinal tract. It doesn't take more than a couple of days. It's not even a lifetime of eating Halloween candies and junk and so forth. It really very rapidly changes what feeds what. Certain foods feed certain bacteria, and so if you're feeding the wrong guys, they're going to develop, they're going to flourish, and you're going to get downstream effects from them flourishing. So obviously the kinds of, again, preaching to the choir in this group, but eating healthy foods, whole food-based diet, organic, natural, all that stuff is going to be hugely important. Unless it's, of course, sorghum cake. Next slide. So this is kind of parlaying into that. Not all bacteria are the same. There's some that are clearly good for both parties. They help us and they help themselves. There's some that are clearly pathologic. And then there's a lot of guys somewhere in between. So what we're trying to do is sort of push the arrows over to the right to get more of those positive, good bacteria that we want living in our guts. Next. What the bacteria do is they will all kind of clump together and they form these things called biofilms, which I always think sounds a little bit gross. I always think of like the Blob from the old movie. And what they do is they'll actually shield each other and share genetic information. And so you can get either good biofilms or bad biofilms. We tend to think of them as all bad, but actually there are good ones, and they can help line the gut, protect it, and help to sort of protect the intestinal wall from any damaged food that comes down. And also protecting you from getting bad bacteria, allowing them to colonize and set up shop. I mean, that's if you've heard of like C. difficile colitis, or C. diff, you guys probably know it as. If you take clindamycin because your kid has a staph infection, and then they're getting really horrid diarrhea or bloody diarrhea, and then the doctor says, oh, you have C. diff, it's because the clindamycin killed all the good guys. The bad guy could then really flourish, set up shop, and start damaging the intestinal tract, and then that's how it manifests. So they're not a bad thing, as long as they're made of the right occupants. Next slide. And so an interesting kind of correlation back to kind of pull it back to Ayurveda is there's a concept in Ayurveda called ama, which is sort of toxicity, sticky, cloudy sort of toxins that can be created in the GI tract, and they can eventually, if they're the wrong biofilms, the wrong toxins, can spread out into the body, and that can cause the antibiotic resistance, poor absorption, and a lot of the other sort of symptoms that we see with the kids. Next slide. So again, just to kind of go back, the kids are in that kapha time, the mucus time. So again, we want to try to make sure that the linings of their respiratory system, the lining of the GI system, there's more and more talk, even in the functional. I just went 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago? Was it last weekend?
2 weeks.
2 weeks ago to the Functional Med Conference in Miami. And they're talking more and more about just leaky nose, leaky lung, leaky, we all know leaky gut, but all these leaky membranes that basically they think, the same process happens in a lot of different places because it's very similar. And so it's the mucus producing in both pieces. Next slide. So, okay, the science shows that there's about 70% of our immune system is in the gut. It's in the GALT, it's called, the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. We have the lymph nodes here, but we have them all over the body. And so what we really want to do is balance the immunity in the gut and that has systemic effects. Next slide. Now this looks very sciencey and nerdy, and I promise I'm not going to go into the details. But basically what this is showing is the cell over on the left, which is called the dendritic cell. Let's see if you can see right there. That's sort of putting its little arms out into the intestinal tract and seeing what's going on. And what that does is that brings the information, it's kind of the recon cell, and it brings the information back to the other T cells, and then depending on what he sees, he'll tell these guys, okay, you need to become either a Th1, a Th2, or a Th17, doesn't matter. But basically what we're trying to do is aim for balance between these things, because if they're imbalanced, then they cause different kinds of diseases, whether they're too much of the Th2 causes more of the allergy type stuff. Too much of the Th1 causes a lot of like the autoimmune stuff like rheumatoid arthritis, dermatomyositis, that kind of thing. Next slide. So you guys probably all know sort of this. If you guys are familiar with the GAPS diet or some of those sorts of things, you probably know all of this. So again, so our gut lining basically looks like a big shag carpet from the 70s. It has, you know, a lot of these, so it kind of is going like this. It goes increasingly into smaller to villi, then microvilli. It's to increase the surface area for absorption. So it's about the surface area of a tennis court in terms of the absorption surface. And normally what we want it to look like is nice and tight junctions. Everything is kind of put together and healthy. Again, I'm sure you guys are familiar with this. When there is damage going on, then you get breaking in the tight junctions, and then you can get proteins that will absorb through the cells themselves or in between the cells, and then that can cause some problems. Next slide.
You lost your...
Oh, I did. All right, that's all right. So this is a little bit nicer cartoon. So this is showing the gluten coming through those tight junctions where they're not supposed to be. And so what happens is that those dendritic cells see this guy, it freaks out because it's not supposed to be there. And so what it does is it tells the other cells, hey, we've got a problem here, we need to get rid of this guy. Because the way that it works is you're an enemy unless proven otherwise, essentially. Because there's just so many possibilities, the body couldn't possibly know everyone from the beginning. So they secrete their sort of chemical warfare antibodies and different histamines and so forth, which then in turn do more damage to the intestinal wall lining, which then allows more leaking in, and so you get this feed-forward cycle. And so the key is that we've got to break that cycle out. Next slide. And so the reason why a lot of us, especially when the kids are young, we're constantly thinking about, I get asked every single day, it seems, you know, I want to boost my kid's immune system, I want to boost, and it's like, it's not just about boosting immunity, it's about balanced immunity. I think that's really the importance. If you remember nothing else, that's the take-home message, it's balance. Because if you have not enough immunity, then obviously you get sick. You know, you get the dysbiosis, you're going to get infections. If you have too much immunity, then you're going to go to the other side. And you know, as much as it's inconvenient and not nice for your kid to have runny noses and suffer all of that, believe me, it's a lot worse for your kid to have Crohn's disease or rheumatoid JIA or some of those other nasties. Next slide. I gotta go fast. So what to do about it? So we'll try to go through this fast because I know we're running out of time. So first one, so Dinacharya is an Ayurvedic concept. Basically, it's just systematizing common sense, okay? It's having a routine that we follow that's predictable and it takes care of our health. So were you going to do this one?
You can go ahead. I lost my place anyway.
Okay, all right. So again, just, you know, again, very common sense. So the first one's, you know, routine sleeping. Next slide, early to bed, early to rise. So obviously, you know, if the kid is overexhausted, they're not going to sleep. If they're not sleeping enough, then they're going to be susceptible to catching more colds. So it's finding the balance in the sleeping pattern that they need. And if they're too exhausted, then obviously they're going to be that kind of wired and tired. You know, we've all had the kid at the end of Disneyland where they're exhausted but they can't sleep, you know, or something like that. They're just so, or a baby that's just overstimulated and you can't break them out of that, and you just eventually they just pass out in exhaustion. But it was a rough road getting them to that point. Next slide. Again, I'm trying to go a little bit fast just to get through all of this. So again, we already talked about the sleep timing. Next slide. The second part of the ritual is, again, this is common sense. Physical activity, yoga, you know, to balance your sugars, your hormones, all of that kind of thing. Next slide. Again, if you don't exercise, we all know you're going to get more susceptible to stress-based diseases, coughs, colds, everything. Next slide. And then it's interesting, even the stress alters your gut bacteria, and there's a whole paper that has proven that. The cortisol, the stress hormone goes in and it alters that. So then again, you get that feed-forward cycle. Next slide. Again, we all know how kids show their stress. So, you know, again, exercise will allow them to get some of that out, and then we get less behavioral problems. Next slide. I wonder why that turned off. That's weird. One thing that's kind of nice, and a big thing in yoga as well, is routine nasal cleansing and moisturizing. I know you guys were on the airplane doing your doTERRA stuff. Next slide. So one thing, if you guys aren't familiar with neti pots, or it's called jala neti, jal means water. It's actually, it looks really horrible. Before I ever did it, I was like, oh yeah, no, I'm not into that at all. That looks unpleasant to say the least. It's really not a big deal at all. You just get you don't use your tap water, you get clean, purified water, you put some of the proper salt in, and then you just sort of put it in, and you sort of tilt your head, and it just sort of just pours through. It's really, you can sit there and have a conversation when you do it. It's kind of strange, actually. Has anyone ever done neti pots here? Yeah, so you know. Okay, so you're all neti potters then. And kids can do them. It's so much about the mind. Younger kids, obviously, you're not going to do it. So it's just some of the basic saline rinses and so forth can always be done, or a little bit of saline drops in their nose. And then you can even put a little tiny bit of, like a drop of coconut oil in there to kind of moisturize, especially in the wintertime. You see kids with a lot of nosebleeds because the heater's on a lot and it's pumping through and it's drying out their mucous membranes. And so just keeping their nose really clean is really important. And there's a whole lot of other nasal stuff in the yogic philosophy, but we won't get into it. Next slide. Elimination, next slide, is obviously important. Contrary to sort of Western medicine, Ayurvedic medicine believes you should actually poop every day. Even though, maybe 3 times?
That's what they say, actually,
yeah.
3 times.
Yeah, so, it's good to kind of keep things moving because, again, it doesn't allow the toxins to recirculate. It's going to just keep everything kind of cleaner in there, which, again, will have less negative stimulation to all the bacteria in your gut. Next slide. Again, some of the signs of some elimination problems are dark circles under the eyes. Are they not getting hydrated? Things like that. Next slide. And then, so Abhyanga is oil massage, which is great for vatas, especially like she was saying, because it helps ground them. A kapha person wouldn't want that. You would want to do more dry, or the brushing or the dry massage, because they're already kind of oily. Next slide. So it's good. It helps just the lymphatics, the nervous system. It's soothing. It's anti-stress. So it's nice. It's a bonding thing, obviously, with families. Next slide. And then lastly, again, next slide, meditation, or some sort of, I think, ritual within your faith, or just, gratitude, obviously not with little kids, but just prayer, meditation, a chance to sort of recalibrate, have your sort of appointment with God, yourself, the higher power, whatever euphemism you like to use for those sorts of issues. Next slide. And then again, a little bit out of time, unfortunately. One of the big things is pulse and tongue diagnosis in Ayurvedic medicine. Ideally they want it pink. If you're white, then you're having too much of that ama, the toxins coming out. If you're red, if you've seen like a geographic tongue, or in the pediatrician's like, it's okay. It's too much fire and digestive fire and you're unbalanced. Or dry and cracked, you're also not having, you have too much vata in there.
Constipation.
And constipation.
Yeah.
Next slide. Do you just want to quickly talk these?
Yeah, I can say.
Just do it fast.
So here are some of the remedies that you may have in your kitchen right now that we use that are really helpful. So turmeric. Turmeric it boosts the immune system, it liquefies mucus, and it totally takes down inflammation. And so for children, like what we do, it totally stops a cold right in its tracks. I mean, I love my doTERRA oils, but this works like magic. I'll take maybe equal parts of turmeric and equal part of raw honey. And I wouldn't give honey to a child under 1. And I would just kind of make a little paste, and I'll give it to them like a little spoonful, like a little goop. And that helps stop a cold immediately. And then also ginger, honey, lemon tea. Ginger decreases inflammation. The lemon detoxifies, and that's really good. It cuts mucus. It's very warming to the body, and you can also stop a cold this way also. Fennel is very good for digestion. You can make sort of a fennel cumin tea, or just, my kids and I love to chew fennel seeds. I carry it in my purse. And then trickatu. This you would not have in your kitchen, but this is a great Ayurvedic herb, and it's a mixture of black pepper, long pepper, and ginger. And this is so good for mucus and allergies. And if you know your child's had a late night kind of pizza, mucus kind of food, this will stop that mucus. You know when you wake up in the morning after you've eaten some mucusy food, you get that kind of frog in your throat? This will cut it right away. And the other day, I could see my youngest one was starting to get kind of the beginnings of a cold, and I didn't have this Trichotube. I was out of it. And I just took pepper in my kitchen cabinet, and I just mixed a little bit of pepper and honey and no mucus. So it's a really great thing. And I buy all of my herbs, some like Trichotube and Chyawanprash and things like that from Organic India. It's a brand online. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's very pure. And then again, cumin for gas and bloating. You can make a cumin fennel tea for them. And this is kind of like the gripe water that you were talking about.
Yeah, like a lot of us are familiar with gripe water, and a lot of these ingredients are in gripe water. It's a British thing, but they probably co-opted it from the Indians, frankly, when they were ruling over the country. Ginger and fennel, and it has, dill and stuff like that in it. So, next slide. We're almost done, I promise. Other things that are not necessarily Ayurvedic, again, you guys all know this. There's tons of studies that show, low levels of vitamin A, D, C, zinc, things like that. So a quick, easy way to get through the winter is obviously a good solid multivitamin. Probiotics we've already talked about, obviously. It's an emerging science. We were just talking earlier about it. Specific probiotics for specific things. It's not well established yet. I mean, they're still figuring all of this out. So how many, what's safe, what's not safe, we're learning. You get a lot of questions about that. How much is too much? Which strain should I take, for the baby, this, that. It's an emerging science. There's not a lot of data, unfortunately, out there, despite claims by a lot of different companies to the contrary, unfortunately. But I think it's coming because there's a lot more interest in it.
But I think food, using your probiotic foods is even more effective than going to the probiotic pill,
absolutely.
Because it's natural and the body knows what to do with it.
Yeah, and again, that's yogurt, kefir, kimchi, sauerkraut, all that other good stuff. Prebiotics are something you have to be a little bit tricky with. They feed the bacteria, which can be a double-edged sword because some of the same things that are prebiotic foods can feed bad bacteria, which you have to be careful with. And also there's a whole kind of new thing, this FODMAPs. I don't know if you guys have heard of that. It's sort of the latest and greatest coming down the pike craze of diets, so you'll be hearing about it, I'm sure, of the health bloggers. Basically, it's fermentable foods. So what it stands for is fermentable oligodimonosaccharides and polyols, which are fruit alcohols. So stuff like apple pectin and larch and some of the things you guys probably are familiar with as prebiotics can be fermented and cause more problems. So you got to be a little bit careful with that stuff. Next slide. And then again, you guys are all on the omega-3s, so I won't bother you with that. Garlic and onions, well-known antibacterial, antiviral, great. Not so much Ayurvedic, but it's in India at least. And again, this is where it's catching up the allicins in the garlic, the quercetin, the sulfur for detox, all that stuff. Medicinal mushrooms, and then a lot of really interesting things, especially for those who can't necessarily breastfeed for whatever reason. There's a lot more coming out with bovine or cow colostrum and lactoferrin to stimulate the gut immunity and try to rebalance things, because some people couldn't breastfeed and then they feel like, oh, my kid is sort of stuck, forever, like they can never get that benefit. But there's more and more coming out where that can maybe be beneficial and get them that. It's not exactly the same, but maybe to try to at least get closer. Next slide. And then again, there's a lot more sort of advanced herbs, which I think, you have to be a little bit more careful doing with little kids because they do have side effects, some of the Ayurvedic herbs. Like I had a little girl that came in with seizure disorder, and a naturopath wanted to put her on Brahmi, which is an Ayurvedic herb, and it can cause more like seizures and things like that and interfere with her thyroid. And so it's not the kind of thing that you just kind of do willy-nilly, especially with a little child. But one thing that's really nice and you could probably play with, another sort of true Indian Ayurvedic thing, is this thing called Chyawanprash, which you can buy at
Pristine
Hydro. And it's this sort of, it's vitamin C kind of goop. It's the umla berry, and it has a lot of different ingredients
Like 40
in it.
different herbs.
Yeah, and it's pretty tasty. The kids like it. And in India, you see everywhere you go, there's little, it's sort of the way we have little kids eating their Flintstone vitamins on the pop thing. You see posters of little kids eating their Chawanaprash.
As
to
their
help keep
multivitamin.
them. And it's a multivitamin.
It's the base is umla, which is like a lot of vitamin C, like 500% vitamin C.
Yeah, so it's good, and it tastes good too. It's not bad. But you'd want to get the organic stuff, because some of the stuff that you'd get like at an Indian grocery store, they still use DDT in India. They still use a lot of yucky stuff.
Organic India is the best brand.
Yeah. And then obviously some other herbs which you're familiar with. So it's fine. Next slide. This is the last slide. So again, at the end of the day, when the diet is wrong, medicine is of no use, and when the diet is correct, medicine is of no need. So I think that's what you're all trying to do here with doing food and lifestyle changes, because no amount of herbs, no amount of probiotics, omegas are ever going to replace good common sense and good lifestyle change. So I think you guys are doing great. Okay, that's it. Sorry we had to rush.
I shake it off.